64. I've been trying to wait for the numbers to build up and they're not going up. So I think we will just proceed. White, how black is black, how white is white, and does white then speak to the manner or to certain attributes that then makes it a bit distinct from black. And the question then is, if you're black in Kenya here, and we get another black in the US and in France and in Japan, if you test their gene, are we likely to see a similarity simply because you, in the eyes of others, you're black, and therefore there is something common among you black? If you're white and we find you're white in Kenya here, in the US, in Japan, if we were to test your genealogy, will we then discover some kind of uniform attribute so that we can conclude that this race itself is something based on the gene and it defines a particular group of people in those categorization as white or black? My aim at the end of this particular class is to demystify that particular notion that actually race has nothing to do with our gene, and it may the color of our skin may be as a result of some other environmental factors, but it cannot then define how then a particular race has constructed will then speak to how a particular individual will behave in a particular circumstances. And that is why we seek then to answer that question as to whether race is merely a social construct, and if so, are there any justification for the positions that we then hold? One of the things that you will agree with me is that there is no universally agreed meaning to the word race. However, one of the writers by the name Ivan Painter, actually just allow me to do this. I don't know who is the host in this particular meeting, because, okay, let me just try to this. Okay, apparently Dr. Jadid is still, I think, the host. Let me see who's the host in this. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm unable to share because, and if I try to claim the host rights, let me see whether if I put in that password, it will give me those rights. Unfortunately, the queue do not accept me to claim the host right, so we'll just proceed. So basically, I say that there is no universally agreed meaning to the term race. And one of the writers, Painter, in his book, The History of White People, he did define race as an idea. And he did mention that race is just an idea, it's not a fact. And he says race is a social status, not a zoological one. It's just a social status. It is a product of history and is not a product of nature. And therefore, the contextual nature of race is something that varies from one place to the other, but is not actually given that it keeps on changing. So what is important from what Neil Paint actually says that race is not something in our gene, it's simply an idea, the way somebody can come up with an idea to make, I saw it on television, somebody has an idea of making plastic toothpicks. And he then came up with that particular idea, manifested that idea, and allowed people to then believe that this particular idea speaks to our natural being. So it says race is an idea, is not a fact. And race is simply a social status. It doesn't go to our zoological, it's not a zoological one. And he says that we all see the world through a racial lens. There's a particular lens that we wear that allows us to see the world through those lenses that colors our world in two compartments. Either the world is black or the world is white. It also goes ahead to then classify people as either Asian, Mexican, African. It will also classify them as majority or minority, or the dominant and the non-dominant, or others. And how we are seen and how we see others generally affect various domains of our lives and the lives of others. How we perceive the people we interact with in many times will then affect the various domains of our lives and the life of others that we interact with. From the types of job we have, the amount of money we make, the kinds of friends we make, the places we live, the food we eat, and the schools we go to, etc., is actually influenced largely by how we see others. So that depending on how we see others, you classify certain food as, I think this food is for Asians, this is for Japanese, this is for Africans, and in Africans you say this is a Kikuyu food, this is a Luo food, this is a Luo food. So all this, how we perceive people, will largely influence how we then interact with them. It will also depend who we employ and where we employ to get jobs. It will also largely determine how much money we make. There are people who will pay you less because of how they perceive you, and there are people who will pay you more because of how they perceive you. There are those people who will allow you to make friends or to become their friends, and those ones who, depending on the number of affluence you make, they will never become their friends. In certain places, you will not live, and they will do all manner of things to ensure you don't live in those places. And in some situation, if they perceive you as one of them, they will try everything possible to get you to live in those particular places. The choice of school, you will find we have everyone transporting their children all the way to Turi. What is it that we are taking children to Turi for? There is a particular how we define ourselves and how you perceive other people. You believe that you belong to that class status, and people of that class status go to a particular school, and therefore you want to identify with that class group. So how we perceive people will really affect our lives and the lives of those who are around us. And therefore, if you look at the concept of racial discrimination as a definition that has been accepted, is actually defined as any distinction or exclusion or restriction or preference based on race or based on color or descent or national or ethnic origin, which has a purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition or the enjoyment or exercise on an equal footing of the human right and fundamental freedom in political, socio-economic, culture, or any other field in public life. So it is simply a particular distinction that which is based on how we perceive people, or a particular restriction or a particular preference that is actually solely based on a particular person's appearance, the color of their skin, their descent, where they come from, or their nationality or their tribe. And the purpose of this is actually to nullify or to impair that recognition as to whether these people are entitled to, or are entitled to the enjoyment, or can exercise the fundamental rights that we enjoy on an equal footing with others. So that distinction would then amount to what we refer to as a racial discrimination. And actually, for an example, an act is racially discriminatory if a person is simply denied a service or employment simply because of his or her race or ethnicity. We deny you this particular job because you are white. We deny you this job because you're black. We are denying this job because you are a Tugen. We are denying this job because you're a Kisi or a Maasai. Then that becomes racially discriminative, or we have a particular policy that impacts unfairly on a particular racial or ethnic group, that you have a particular policy that actually limits the accessibility of a particular group to certain employment or certain job. So the question then we need to ask ourselves is whether what we mean by the term social construct. What is a social construct? And a social construct is simply an idea or a notion that appears to be natural and obvious to people who accept it, but may or may not represent a particular reality. So it remains largely an invention or an artifice of a given society. A social construct, as I've said, is an idea. That is why Irving did say a race is simply an idea. So a social construct is an idea or a notion that appears to be natural and obvious to people who accept it, but may or may not represent the reality. So it remains largely an invention or an artifice of a given society. The same way we've been told blacks are poor, blacks are Africa is a black continent, is a continent of problem, it's a problem of turmoil. Somebody creates that idea, plants that idea into our mind. We then believe that maybe it's natural that we are in that particular predisposition that everything bad is black and Africa is then black. So it becomes so obvious to certain people that Africa is a continent of problems. We're the same country that, and actually we travel to some countries in Europe, they will ask you whether we've been told that in Africa there's a lot of mosquitoes. And if we hear them, the way they're talking is like you have to actually struggle walking around Africa because of mosquito, because it's a place full of mosquito and it bites people, and they actually get surprised how then you survive because of this particular continent that has mosquito. And therefore they have it is a particular notion that has been spread more and more times, that actually even those of us who live in Africa then tend to actually believe that this is natural to us. It is obvious that we live in such a clouded and cursed continent, and so for some reason we have been made to believe that that is a reality, but in the true sense it is not a reality per se. Yes, Odhiambo.
Odhiambo, I have a concern, a request. When you started, your volume was okay, but I think along the way you're very low. I request that probably you adjust.
Okay, I have just increased the volume. Is it any better?
We will tell you when we proceed, but when you started, you're very clear.
Okay.
And audible enough.
I don't know what is then happening.
It's all
Okay,
right.
so let's Hastings.
Mwalimu, now that my colleague has disrupted, do you have a question? May I ask now, sir?
Yes, please, and I hope I am loud enough.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
My question, sir, is so race a social construct that appears natural, can represent reality or not. Now, what is the distinction therefore between race and ethnicity? Because I've heard as if we are now using them somewhere interchangeably. Are they interchangeable?
Yeah, there's we will come to ethnicity. I'm still on race, and then I'll come to ethnicity. If you can just be patient with me on that. Is that okay, Akoth?
Yes, sir. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
I'm struggling to understand what you just explained a few minutes ago, that that race is actually not a reality, that it is a construction of the mind. But we know that in every setup that we go to, there are always distinctions that are very real. Not just appearance, but even how people probably dress, what they eat, their beliefs. Societies are extremely different, and that's the reason why we even struggle to have laws that are uniform across regions. Because if you here in Kenya, for example, people take 18 years to be the age of majority, legally speaking. But you go down to Tanzania, here it is 15 years. The Islamic part of Sudan, I hear it is 10 years. And every society comes with their own rules that are very distinct. And that's the reason I'm struggling to understand why some people would argue that that ethnicity, that race is just
that race. It's an idea.
It's an idea,
and I started by saying, and I'll try to qualify that soon, that if indeed race is something that is so distinct, so that if you're classified as black or white, one of the things we will want to establish is that if you're black in Kenya, and we test your gene in Kenya, and we go and find a black American in the US, and we get another black living in Japan, if we test their gene, we should then be able to see some similarity, right? Because then you belong to the same race. And if you're white, we should also see the similarity across. But then I want to demystify that notion that you will find a distinction. You will find that that particular race is not in the gene. And therefore, the mere fact that you're black in Kenya does not necessarily mean that the gene of another black person in Nigeria, in South Africa, in the US, that there will be a similarity. There will be a difference. And actually, even to go back to your explanation about all these other differences, those differences are man-made. They are differences that we then have created, in the sense that even if you look at what you say, that even the food is different because of your environmental factors and your social disposition. So that if you find yourself in Kenya, what we in Kenya define as food, if you go to the next country, what they define as food, there may be that particular difference. But then if you go to that country with time, you will find yourself eating that particular food. So you will not then die of hunger because the food that you're used to in Kenya is not there. You will then eat the food that is there. So you eat the food that is available in the area that you find yourself. It's like, for instance, trying to get the Maasais who live in Kajiado and they will not have actually had any contact with fish to try and eat fish. It will require some kind of learning. They have to unlearn and learn for them then to be able to eat that particular food. So the environmental factors is what then makes people to be different. And even these particular countries, you say Kenya and Tanzania, they partition and they scramble for Africa that then came up with these particular artificial boundaries. That is what distinguishes a particular practice and a social, a particular culture that you find in Tanzania that is not here, because of this particular boundary that has stopped the movement of people from one place to the other. But in reality, if you look at all these things based on what Ivan actually was saying, is simply an idea. And this idea has been planted into you that has made you believe that these particular things are actually real. But maybe in some instances, it may not actually represent, I'm using the word may, it may not actually represent the reality. It may actually remain largely that particular invention that a particular society has actually given itself and chosen to perceive things in a particular way. And actually, for example, if you look at something like gender, which represents ways of talking, describing, or perceiving men and women, is also a socially constructed entity. Generally, if you generally distinguish, is actually generally distinguished from sex, which is biological. Sex is biological, but gender speaks to the role that you assign to this particular biological distinction. And that is why you then say male, female, masculine, feminine. And these notions of gender actually represents that attempt by society through the socialization process to actually construct a particular masculine or feminine identities and the corresponding masculine and feminine gender roles for a child based on their physical appearance and genitalia. So you look at the physical appearance of the child, you say, this is a boy. And then you go and define that because he's a boy, you then ascribe certain roles to this particular boy. And I'll give you a general example. So that if you look at the setup that we find ourselves, you'll find the way we bring our girls up to then learn how to cook, and we tell them their places in the kitchen. So that they grow up believing that I, as a girl, as a woman, my role is in the kitchen and to cook, and therefore women make good cooks, and therefore that is their role. Again, it's an idea. It's not true. It's not a reality. It's not ingrained in their biological composition that is their role. Because if it were so, then we will also be able to go and look at all the big star hotels, and we should be able to go and look at all the chefs. Then if it is their role and it's ingrained in their biological condition, we should then find that all those people in those kitchens are then women. It's not true. It's not true, because then, in all those particular big hotels, you find 80% of those particular chefs that you call chef are then men. Simply meaning that that aspect of actually cooking is not something that speaks to the sex identity of a particular individual. The gender thing which we then construct is a social construct that we then choose that because you're feminine, this is the role you're supposed to do. Because you're masculine, this is the role you're supposed to do. And then people are brought up believing in those particular that those are the reality, but they may not be naturally true. It may simply be those particular ideas as a society has ascribed to itself and decided that this is how we are going to define our society, but it may not necessarily be the actual capability or ability of that particular distinction that we have created for the two different persons. And that is why we are making an argument that race is a social construct. There is no gene or cluster of genes common to all blacks or all whites. Were race a real thing in the genetic sense, then racial classification for individuals will remain constant across boundaries if it were a real a real thing in the genetic sense. It ought to be constant across boundary, irrespective of where you find yourself. In Africa, for example, human beings are at their most diverse. There is about as much differences between a Kenyan and a Nigerian, and as between a Swede and Japanese, but both tend to get grouped in a particular group of being black or either being white.
Excuse
But
me,
then,
Mwalimu.
yes, Moses Ali.
Sorry for cutting you short. My question, what I wanted to ask is actually what you are talking about now. That is why I've decided to, cut you short. Now, if you say that that if race were true, then you would expect the gene of a black man from Kenya to more or less be the same as genetic composition of somebody in the US or in the UK. In my view, are you comparing science with what then you say is not scientific? It's an idea. Are they comparable? Genetic composition and of course race as we know it. This guy is black. This is white. That is my concern. Do we compare what is a scientific provision and what we say is not true?
My submission to that is that race itself, the aspect that you're black or white does not speak to your genealogy. That is a submission I'm making. So that if indeed it speaks to your genealogy, then it will mean that if you get a black person because the gene of the black person is X, then we should then be able to expect if we went to South Africa, we got a black person, his gene will be X. If race speaks to the genealogy of that particular complexion. And my submission is it does not. That is the submission I'm making. That it does not speak to the genealogy. So whenever we talk about race, we classify people as black, white, colored. It does not speak to their gene, because gene is a scientific thing, which actually will tell you either you're X or you're Y or you're Z. But that X, Y, Z, you will find it among the blacks, you will find it among the whites. It will not be limited to you because you are black. That is the argument I'm making. Moses?
But then that is appreciated, Malimo. But then, of course, I appreciate the fact that... May I?
Yes, Moses.
Of course, I appreciate the fact that you say this is not true. It's a thing that we've created in our mind. But then, what is the basis of them saying that Dr. Koth is black and maybe Ashura is white? Is it just based on their color that we that we can see?
I don't know. There's somebody talking in the background. Nelson, can you mute? Yes, Moses. Hi. Edith, please mute.
Okay, let me make it simple, Malimo.
Yes.
We would say Dr. Stephen Akoth is black because you look at him and he's black. And then I would say, for example, that Angela is white because you look at him and he's white. So this is based on what we see.
I totally agree that it's based on what you see. But remember now, we are looking for, when we talk about discrimination on the basis of race, you want to look at Dr. Koth as black. Then you assign certain attributes to Dr. Koth because he's black, and then you say, because he's black, then these attributes will fall. Like, for instance, you say that blacks, from the lens of the white people, blacks are supposed to be literate. They're supposed to be practicing some archaic traditions. So simply because he's black, you attribute all those things to him, and then you use that to treat him differently because he's black. And what you're submitting is that the mere fact that he's black does not speak to those particular attributes. And therefore, you can't come up with a common generalization that because you're black, you're supposed to behave in a particular manner. this particular behavior, you will behave in that manner whether you're black, whether you're white, and whether you're brown. Is that true, Moses?
I get your explanation. I get you right.
That is where I'm coming from, that this particular distinction about attributes that we assign to race is simply an idea of how we perceive people. It does not necessarily, it's not a reality. It does not define them in their individual capacity. It is how we've decided to perceive them. The same way, and later we will see when you talk about, when you discriminate based on the race, there are people who will employ a particular white person because you believe he is competent. The fact that he's white speaks to the fact that they are superior than we black. And I think that notion has been created over time, that there are people who actually believe that because I'm black, I'm less, or rather I'm inferior to a white person. And it is that particular concept of ascribing superiority or inferiority based on the color of the skin that you're saying that is an idea. It's not a reality. It's not something that can be justified based on science. That science has actually shown that by virtue of you being black, you are less superior or you are inferior to a white person. It's an idea that has been allowed to perpetuate, that even those who practice the same actually believe that that is factual, but it may not be the reality on the ground. And that is the submission I am trying to make with regard to this social race being a social construct. So there's nothing real or absolute about social construction in the same way as there's nothing absolute or real about rocks, rivers, or mountains, and in general, objects examined by physics. For example, we are told the existence of a mountain is not contingent on a collective acceptance or imposition or an agreement. We don't all need to agree that a mountain exists. A mountain will exist irregardless, rather will exist regardless of people's thinking or agreeing or accepting that it does exist. Unlike a mountain, the existence of a race requires that people collectively then agree and accept that it actually does exist. And you'll find that there is a particular school of thought that actually supports this view of race, which is based on, they will look at it as the color of the skin, the language, the culture, and where they observe that if you look at this thing about language, culture, there is nothing biologically real about them. This particular language can be learned or they can be unlearned in one way or the other. And to see how race has then been used in that particular context and how it's an evolving thing, there is a particular case, an old case in the US, in the United States, versus Takao Ozawa, what we refer to as the Takao Ozawa case of 1922, where Takao did argue that based on scientific evidence, he was white. Nonetheless, Justice Sutherland argued that he was not Caucasian, and hence he could not be white, and consequently denied him citizenship. Now, the ruling denying Takao, that's the second case. So the first case was the case of United States versus Bhagat Singh. This is 1923, and this Singh was an Indian American man. He filed for citizenship in the US in 1923 and was denied on the basis of him not being white. The US Supreme Court found that while Indians were anthropologically categorized as Caucasian, the understanding of the common man, in quotes, the understanding of the common man, wrote Justice Sutherland, knows perfectly well that there are unmistakably and profound differences between the Caucasians who are Indians and the Caucasians who you find in the US. And hence, despite, and the court held that hence, despite being Caucasian, what many in the past and almost everyone today believe to be white, Singh is not white in that particular respect. And on the basis of that, he was denied his citizenship because he was not white. And the effect of this particular Supreme Court ruling retroactively affected all Indians who had already been granted citizenship, because then, even within the definition of the Caucasian, they were deemed not to be white. And remember what Justice Sutherland then says, that everyone in the understanding of the common man, everyone knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between the Caucasian that you find in Asia and the Caucasian that you find in Europe and in the America. And on the basis of that, they then introduce the fact that they are not white as white they expect them to do and to be. And if you look at that, it's all based on, when he says the understanding of the common man, it's how they perceive these particular people. So you look at them, you look at the expression, and you see that they're different. Then you realize they're different from us, and therefore they cannot be white. But they're not white simply because of what? How you look at them. Then the second case is the United case versus Takao, which actually spoke to the same particular finding. And in Takao Ozawa case in 1922, Takao did argue that based on scientific evidence, he was white. They can do science, the research showed that he was white. Nonetheless, Justice Sutherland then argued that he was not Caucasian, and hence he could not be white. And consequently, his citizenship was denied on the basis that he was not Caucasian and therefore not white. And this ruling in the Takao case and in the Singh citizenship actually strengthened the anti-Asian sentiment. And such powers included the right to vote, run for political office, and various other legal powers that had been ascribed to those who are white as a privilege of those who are white, so that if you're not white, these particular rights are not available to you. So simply because of that finding that you are not Caucasian, then you lose these particular rights, which ideally we have mentioned they are rights which are fundamental rights that are supposed to be enjoyed by all. And in addition, other powers that are not as codified or legal, such as access to work union, certain academic institutions, and certain neighborhoods were also disabled by such a particular finding of the fact that you are not Caucasian and therefore you are not white. And therefore, the submission then has always been that race is not biological. The color of your skin has nothing to do with biology. It's simply a social construct, and there is no gene or a cluster of genes common to all blacks or to all whites. You'll find a person who could be categorized as black in the United States might actually be considered white in Brazil or colored in South Africa. And you can actually, there are people who will come to this country and you'll find that we'll define them as white, but they go to the US, they'll be defined as black. And I'm sure, I know Steve Okoth very well. He has traveled, I'm sure he has found time South Africa to go South Africa. And you've seen people who introduce themselves that I am black, but there's nothing black about them. But they identify themselves as black. I see P. Wanyoike's hand is up. Yes, Wanyoike.
Thank you, Mwalimu. The idea of race, I agree with you that there's really nothing called as race really doesn't exist, because when I had a chance to do some history on the rulers, on the kings, and the kings in Denmark particularly, and there's a rich history of how some of the queens or some of the mothers or the kings of that country were actually Africans. If you look at their bosoms, they have got the features for most of them were the African features. But the idea of race, like you have Putre said, was actually from the 18th century. It was about classifying people, how for purposes of enslavement. And, like when you look at the mind of the Black inferiority, how the Blacks did not have a coherent mood of resistance to like what the Irish had against the British, or even what the Germans had. Some of the Germans had against the people from Slovenia and the rest against the Germans. You find that race as such, there's nothing as race. It's like you say, it's a construct that was designed to make what people used to call the great chain of being. Where do you place this person? And that God did not make everyone equal. What people actually say that if you look at your fingers, our fingers are not equal. And that hierarchical, this ancient the paradigm that involved all the creatures, from the smallest to human beings and to God, it is so race became a good constructive way of placing people to where they are. So it is not genetic race. It has no scientific classification. And I think throughout history, nobody has ever really defined what race is. And I do agree with you as the fact that it is a construct. It is in the minds of those who would like to feel they are more superior than others. Even in this country, when you talk of the Kikuyu, the Maasai, or whatever, there's an element of connotation of a superiority over the other person. So it's a construct. So, but there's nothing, and I agree with you, there's nothing like this.
Yeah, thank you, Wanyoike. I can see this is inviting a lot of discussion. Good submission, Isaac Kamau.
Yes, Daktari. My question would be: yes, we agree that race has no genetic composition or structure, and we may not be able to push it that way. But now, from the construction, the artificial construction by people, to bring the issue about race, then do we dispense with the fact that we've seen discrimination taking place on the aspect of this thing that now we are belittling, that it really doesn't exist, it doesn't need to be given the pedestal where it is. I've seen people, whites on the TV, say that white people thinks better than blacks. We've seen various differences that comes along the way. And also, can someone even if we are saying that maybe there's no defense that you are discriminated because you are racist, then does it really rub, or wipes the aspect that we've really seen discrimination taking place?
Discrimination. Discrimination. One of the reasons why we are studying this particular unit is to create that particular knowledge and awareness that when we discriminate people on the basis of language, color of their skin, or what you refer to as their ethnicity or their race, all you're trying to say is that that particular position that allows you to treat them differently is unwarranted, because that difference you're trying to see does not actually exist. It's something that we've created in our mind that there is a difference, but that difference does not speak to the attribute of that person. There is this guy called, let me give you an example. I think it's called Kiano Gikoni, Dr. Kiano. I think Dr. Kiano was the first Kenyan to get a PhD, right? Isn't that true?
Yes, yes.
What is the ethnic background of Dr. Kiano?
He was a Kikuyu.
He was a Kikuyu, correct. But have you grown in this country where you have been told that the brightest people in this country are Luos? Have you had that notion?
Yes.
So if that was a fact,
Yeah.
if that was a fact, then how is it that Alu was not the first one to have a PhD? It's simply, yes. Yes,
That
Chrysostom.
PhD has nothing
Can I try
to
to
do with
respond?
it, right?
Yes, Chrysostom.
No, I think just finish first, Mwalimu. The question is coming after yours. I'm not don't want to respond to this. I have another question.
Yes. So basically, I'm just trying to give that particular example that there is a way we can create an idea, and we've grown up in that space where people have said that Luos are bright because they eat fish, and now everyone who can then decide now let's try and eat fish and become like the Luos, but it's simply an idea. Somebody came with it, we believed it, we live it, and we believe that that is actually a reality. It may not actually be a reality based on that particular example that I've actually given, that you can actually see people who are not from that community who are actually excelling academically. So it's just a question of an individual effort and not necessarily his ethnic background or his race. If you look at this story about the first people to land in the moon, the story has been created that it actually shows the superiority of the Caucasian, the white man, who invented and came up with that particular idea and put the first man in space. But in reality, if you go down to that story, the people, the scientists behind the whole thing were actually some black women who were mathematicians who actually came up with the entire formula. But history then creates that notion that this white man is so superior that they were able to put man in the moon. But the real story is actually clouded, so that you are made then to believe that particular notion that a white man is then superior because he is not telling his story, and his story has been suppressed. We are not telling the facts as it is. So we create a particular stereotype or particular prejudice against a particular race because of the element of dominancy. So the dominant group will always want to be able to show that they are superior, but in reality, that may not be true. The truth might lie elsewhere. Daniel.
Yes, I want to agree with you that certain aspects of race could actually be social construct, could be a creation of the mind. But we also know that there are certain aspects that are not just social construct. There are certain aspects that are actually very real.
Yes.
They are factual, if I could use that term.
Yes.
Aspects like color, for example. There's a big difference between somebody who is black and somebody else who is white. and those
What's the
differences are
dif-
very clear.
What's the difference?
The difference is color.
Color, yes, I agree. So color, you're looking at the skin, isn't it?
Yeah, the skin, and
Mhm.
and that difference actually goes down to the genes. So that if for example, a black man
Mm.
was to be married to a white woman,
Mm.
and their offspring,
Mm.
could the offspring, they will have a child who will have traits that run across both of them. You can tell that maybe the color of the skin was taken from the father, or the shape of the nose was taken from the mother. You can actually tell differences. The type of hair that they have. These things run into the genes. So they're actually differences that are factual. They're not just a creation of the mind.
You're
But
describing biological differences. And for me, my submission is that race is not biological.
But we know that where race has been involved, color has also been involved.
Which is true. I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that. Your color is more or less informed by other factors. Some of it environmental factors, but it may not necessarily be biological. The fact that you inherit, you look like your father is biological because it's in the gene. And me, I'm saying race is not in the gene.
The differences are in the gene, all right. But now, what people want to, if people want to maybe exclude a certain group of people, then they will refer to the color. Like I remember before independence, they used to paint. They used to put posters that no dogs, no blacks, no. I don't know what was the other term, but actually you can see that they were judging by the color.
Yes, isn't that prejudice that people have because of what they perceive with their eyes? That you think black is less inferior, so he deserves to be treated in a certain way. Isn't that because of what you see? So that if you're not able to see that, if for instance, if you're blind, will you be able to tell white or black? You will not be able to tell white or black. So it's because you perceive one as white or black, and then there's a manifestation that has been implanted in your mind that a white person is superior than a black person. And therefore, you tend then to believe that notion as if that is a reality, that indeed we have done science, we've done a lot of research, and science has actually shown that a white man is superior than a black man. Is there such evidence out there?
But I would also argue that those are the aspects that maybe exist only in the mind.
Yes.
Because we know for a fact that it is not true that whites are superior than blacks, or maybe the Luos are superior than that the Luos are the brightest. It may or may not be the truth. Those are some of the things that people create in the mind, but there are also certain aspects that are actually very real.
Of course, I'm not disputing the realness of certain aspects. Some biological differences are real. That I accept. There are some biological differences that are real. But what I'm trying to point across, and maybe you will answer me, is race biological?
That is what, and my answer, if you posed that question to me, I would say in certain aspects, yes, it is. In certain aspects, it is, because like you're saying, the color of the skin is biological. Somebody's IQ, in certain cases, could be biological. And then, that could form basis for someone discriminating against another. People could be excluded just by the color of their skin.
And
so we see an instance.
And they're being excluded every day because of the color of their skin.
Yes. Which means that it now ceases to be a creation of the mind, but now it becomes a reality. That if you say white, you don't allow white people here, then you look at the color of the skin to decide who comes in or who remains out. If they say black people are not allowed in here, you simply have to look at how the color of the skin to decide who comes in and who remains out.
And that is why we see that then amounts to discrimination, because it's not a justifiable distinction. Because that distinction that you are then making to allow whites are not black is not backed by science. Because for you, by the time you're doing that distinction, there is a particular predisposition that you have towards that particular color. That this person who's white is better than this person who's black. So you lock the black person out. But the reality then is that really factual, that that white person is better than this black person? It's not true. That's what you're saying. And that's what you're saying. There will be no legal or reasonable justification for that discrimination. And that's why you're telling you shouldn't discriminate based on that particular race. Because what then makes you distinguish this particular two people is simply an idea that has been implanted in your mind, but it's not a reality. So you need to give the two of them a chance. Because one, they are human beings and they're entitled to those particular rights, as opposed to determining what rights are available to a black man and what rights are available to a white man. There should be no that distinction. Moses.
Gava has asked a very valid question in the chat. I hope we look at it. And then I wanted just to ask, let me take you back a bit. I know we are not talking about gender, but do this argument that we have now applies in gender as well? That gender as well is an idea of the mind?
The roles you ascribe to the gender is also a social construct. Is what you create in your mind, that when you start defining certain roles, these are boys' roles, these are female roles or something. Where do you get those roles from to assign to the different sexes? Because gender is different from sex. When you talk about the sex, then it's clear there's a distinction and what the female can do from the male. But gender is how people then identify themselves, not necessarily based on sex. So and I gave that particular example where you say that the place of women is in the kitchen. You are assigning a particular role to a particular gender. Is that really true, that that particular gender is the only one that is predisposed to do those particular roles? Or it is how we as a society have come up with a list, a menu of lists, then divided those lists by saying from 1 to 6 will be done by women. From 6 to 12 will be done by men. Isn't it we as a society who have actually created that role? Because if it was something that actually that is based on the sexual organ, then it will simply mean that if you give a woman a different task that we are assigned to the male gender, then they will find it difficult to perform. But we are yet to see those particular roles that then the women cannot then perform because of their gender or how they identify themselves. Chrysostom, I'm told you've asked a valid question somewhere. Let me look for it.
Yeah, Mwalimu, I was just trying to check out because laws are based on facts, and even should you go argue out in court of law, it will be based on facts. So I was trying to ask if at all we have laws against racial discrimination. And then if we tell we have laws against racial discrimination, what do they describe race as? Are they basing on a race on what we see, or basic on an idea that doesn't exist?
Yeah, I'm trying to package this thing in such a way that we will then be able then to understand. When you look at so if you look at South Africa as a standalone anti-discrimination law, which for us we've captured it in the constitution by saying you cannot discriminate on whatever grounds, race, ethnicity, whatever religion, what. But then they have a standalone legislation. Now, this difference we are talking about when we talk about black or white, we are saying, when you're saying, is there a law? We are simply putting across that this particular pigment issue in our skin does not then define the person behind the skin to warrant a differentiated treatment because of the color of their skin. They ought to be treated alike when it comes to access and the enjoyment of the fundamental rights. So we don't even need to belabor the aspect of their difference, the way they look like. Of course, we are different. If you look at the Chinese, the way their eyes are, if you look at the complexion, we as black, the color is different from the whites. But does that go to define the attributes of that person behind that black skin? Or we are all human beings? It's only that, like for instance, if you look at our cows in Africa here, and if you look at the cows in some states in the US, you will see a great difference in those particular cows. Do they make it do the cows in Africa become less of a cow because they look different from the cows in the US? Because the environment there, if it's in a cold area, you will see them. They will actually have they will adapt to the environment, and therefore their features will be different from the features of the cows in Kenya. Does that difference warrant a differentiated treatment simply because of their different physical attributes? The answer is no. They still remain cows. And that's the argument. We are simply saying in racial discrimination that the color of my skin does not define me, and it shouldn't define me to warrant me being treated differently, as it were in those particular days where somebody has said dogs, blacks, and whites were put separately simply because of the color of their skin. That particular distinction is not justifiable to warrant a particular different treatment in how they access their fundamental rights. That is the submission I'm trying to make.
Mwalimu, sorry, can I say something?
Please do.
I kind of don't agree with you in terms of the example you have given of the animal.
Which is okay.
Because I mean, like we've had people, and I think myself, whereby you say that the taste is different because of even the environment and what they eat. So I think then if I said I wanted a cow which comes from this regional area, Sudan, because it tastes differently, I'm not discriminating. So I think the example was not good, but it's my opinion.
Does it taste different?
I think so. But okay, thank you.
Okay, Franklin.
Yes, thank you, Mwalimu. We're enjoying this discussion. For me, I wanted to bring to your attention a certain construct that is usually there regarding the black man, and that the black man, as compared to other races, quote unquote, is biologically well endowed. And I wanted to say that we do not know who came up with that study, but we thank them, and we do not want that notion to be changed. We would wish that it remains the same. And whether it's true or not, it does not matter, because we are dealing with constructs here.
They are
So
well
that is a
endowed.
construct
They are well endowed in what?
biologically.
Okay, I hear
Yeah,
you.
so that was on a light note, Mwalimu.
Yeah, I know, I hear you. Let's hear Daktari and then Steve.
Mwalimu, thank you. I wonder whether perhaps the framing issue here is that race is not just a social contract, but it is politics. The issue here is the assignment of meaning to color or those attributes, and then the significance that is accorded to it. Because if you look at the way it's been deployed, including in archival literature in Kenya, you'll see that there's a time when the colonial clerks used to talk about the various language groups as races. So you get a document where I talk about Kikuyu race, Luo race, so on. And then they became keen, especially after the Second World War. You see the documents changing, where now race is seen to be a category of civilization compared to ethnicity. So that the significance and the meaning attached to that description shifts, and tribe is used at that time to describe the non-Caucasians, and the idea is to build a hierarchy. So perhaps maybe with your guidance, and we defer to how you put it, could be that the issue is our definition doesn't stop at social construction, but extends to suggest that it is also about the meaning allocated to it and the significance of that meaning. And that is what, as a law class, perhaps we are interested in. I don't know what you think about that. Thank you, sir.
I totally agree, Dr. on that, and that is why we try to move away from any instances where we can discriminate based on race, because the meaning we assign to race, as you correctly put, and some of it may be political, which we then use that to try and subjugate a particular group of people because of certain privilege that we want to then obtain from a particular situation. So you try to characterize people differently because of how they then appear, and then you justify that. And I like the fact that you went back to the medieval period where that was a notion. Then it kept on changing, so that if race was a biological thing, then we will not expect it to change. It can be something that varies from one person to the other. It ought to be constant. But it is not constant, because then it is actually shaped by people's perception of things and the gains that they would want to obtain from a particular situation or another. And more so, for many a times, it is actually for political gain. That is why they would try to ascribe some kind of superiority to one particular race and not the other. So I totally agree with what you're saying. Anyone I have left out? And in real science in itself, there are social constructivists who have actually claimed that actually science does not give adequate support to the idea of real racial distinction. That social constructivism then becomes true, and the argument always is as follows: that if there are real racial differences, other than how we simply look by the color of our skin, if there were actually real deep ingrained racial differences, then science will have come out and explained those particular differences. But science has not actually explained racial differences. Therefore, there are no real racial differences. Since the racial differences are either real or social constructed, we can actually then conclude that it's actually race is a social construct. And one of the most common argument for social construction of race is along the following lines. That firstly, that if racial differences are real, then racial classification schemes will not vary from time to time and place to place. Number two, that racial classification schemes will always, you will find them vary from time to time and place to place. For instance, the same mixed race individual might be considered black or white in different places and at different times. And for example, a varying standard of blackness actually proves nothing about racial realities. First, the very idea of categorizing mixed race individual as black or white is very problematic, simply because they are mixed. Given that they are neither black, neither are they white. It is not surprising that people make a different decision if they have to classify them as one or the other. And therefore, it may be an arbitrary social convention to simply say somebody like Barack Obama is black, is a black man. But it is an objective fact of nature that he had a white mother and a black father, and is therefore half white and half black. Therefore, these racial differences are actually not real. And hence, since racial differences are either real or social construct, then they must be social construct, because then we are trying to categorize people as one and not the other. So what do we do with the people like Barack Obama? How do you then put him in that particular silo that he is black or not white? And if you look at the history of discrimination and apartheid in South Africa, it was even worse to be brown. It was worse to be in that Obama shoes. So for them, it was better if you are pure white or pure black, but you couldn't be this particular mixture, which they couldn't place where it is. But then it didn't define those particular people. It didn't justify a differentiated treatment to those particular individuals. And therefore, if you look at race as a social construct, which actually is produced by a particular dominant group in a particular society, and their power to define, and that is actually what Dr. Koth will simply say. We have a dominant group which ascribed itself the role of defining and giving meaning to this particular term. And in other words, this particular dominant group in a society imposed this particular boundary of the group membership by defining race in terms of biology. And so that if you are black, then you are biologically inferior to a white person. And Africans in America were first brought to America as indentured servants. After completing the terms of their servitude, they were then freed and had the status of free men. The color line at that time had not been drawn. Nonetheless, with the growing population of free Africans in America, there was that particular fear of losing the hegemonic control, which began then to spread throughout the white population. And due to this, race as a biological concept was then developed and used to justify the enslavement of the growing free Black population early in the US. And this initial biological understanding of race actually helped to draw that particular color line, the boundary of group membership, which were marked by skin color, till this day as a primary race indicator in the skin color, so that when we talk about race, we first look at the skin, and then we say, you look different from the way I am, and therefore you are not entitled to certain rights, or you must then be treated in a different manner. And therefore, race in itself is simply a category of people who have been singled out as inferior or superior, often on the basis of their physical characteristics, such as skin color, the hair texture, or the shape of their eyes. Based on these particular physical attributes, then they are classified in those two silos. Either you're inferior or you're superior. Superior according to, inferior according to a particular individual. It may be these perceived biological characteristics that distinguish people, they are not based on scientific facts. They are not based on any scientific fact. And the concept itself has no validity in the human species. Race is simply self-identification by people according to the race or races with which they most closely identify or are identified. So that you'll find, and there was that during Bill Clinton when he won the presidency, there is a way the Black community in the US really identified with him, and they believe that he was the first Black American president. But he was white. So people feel or identify with him, or they feel closely related to his ideas, and therefore they identify with him. And therefore you can even find a white person who identifies as Black because then he looks at the attributes of the Black people and he identifies with them. So why do we study this particular race? And a lot of us have explained this aspect is because we all live racially structured lives. And this racially structured lives is based on two myths, that there is a pure race and there is a superior race. And this is then what then informs how we relate with others. And this particular proposition of the existence of a pure race and a superior race then affects our life chances. It affects our education. It affects our health. It affects our religious views. It affects our occupation. It affects how long we live on this particular earth. As some members had actually said, that is a reality. We are being treated differently. We are being discriminated. It is true. We are being discriminated. But is it a justifiable discrimination? Do we have an equal access to education, to health, to a religious view, to occupation? Look at the advent of the colonialism and Christianity in Africa. And those of you who are students of history, you will realize that the Kikuyus had a name for God, Ngai. The Luos had a name for God. The Maasai had a name for God. All the communities that existed prior to the white man landing in our shore had a name for God, and they believed in a certain supreme being who they were worshiping. But then the white man came, and he came with a certain book which was well written, and he told them, forget about these other gods you're worshiping. There is this other God who is in this particular book, who is a living God that you need to focus on. And if you want to be like me, you must then be able to come to church every Sunday. We teach you about this particular book, and forget about this other one you worship anywhere else there. And somehow we all turned around and believed in the God of the white man. And this particular God, he told us he's white. He's like him. And we've grown up believing God was white and Jesus was white. But then history, if we look at the same history they tell us in that book, where Christ spent his time walking around, he was simply walking somewhere in Africa here. And that is why some people have actually arrived at that conclusion that if you actually follow this story of this white man, the way he's telling us, actually Christ was Black. He was not white, he was not Caucasian, because he was busy walking around here and spent his time in Africa here. Whether that is true or not, that's another thing altogether. But then this meaning that we ascribe to the race really affects the life chances. It affects our ability to acquire certain education. It actually shapes our religious view. It shapes our occupation. Look at the clinical trials that we keep on doing, and all these companies are keen to come and do clinical trials in Africa. We are the guinea pigs, or the people who can die so that the superior, the dominant group can actually survive. Why? Because we've allowed that notion to apply. Our poverty, in quotes, has made us subject ourselves to the white man superior complex. But then it's because we have not been made, or we've not allowed ourselves to understand the richness that we have in Africa. And actually, there's a clip that actually is circulating on YouTube about, or in WhatsApp group about, I think she's a first lady of one of the countries who actually was putting a submission that Africa is richer. There is nothing Africa requires from anywhere. But because we have been made to believe we are poor, we believe in that poverty, and we look up to the West to be able then to get nourishment or to get these particular things. Yet we can actually be self-sufficient in Africa if we are allowed to reflect internally and look at our potential. But then a narrative will always be put in place whereby you will not then be able to look at the potential we have in Africa to self-sustain and to grow internally without having to look at the West. But then you're told the West is where everything happens. That is why, given us slightest opportunity, we will always go to the West for education, for everything. And given a chance, we would want to stay in the US because it's a better life. And I gave that example to the class this morning. I had a particular people who was in our chambers, and he went for masters at Syracuse University in New York. And he finished. He was supposed to come back. The next time I called him because he's still on our letterhead, and asked him, why are you not coming back? And he said the Kenyans he's met there, he has been persuaded that he cannot go back to Africa. You can't leave this opportunity, and the money you make here is incomparable to whatever money that you can make in Africa and in Kenya in particular. And I asked her, so what are you currently doing? And he told me he is a food inspector, inspecting food in this particular company that packages food for the airlines, and therefore he goes around testing to ascertain quality. And I asked him, so what did you go to do in the US? What degree did you go to pursue? He went to do a master's in law. And I asked him, so how do you relate the two? He said, for now we are looking at what puts food on the table. This particular career as a legal scholar will not then pay me the way this one is paying me in the UK, in the US. It's again a question of choice. Is that a perception that is the dominant economy, is a dominant country? You can't come back to the land of malaria, disease, illiteracy, and all other things that happen in Africa. So if you look at all this particular concept of race, it's actually, and I think it was it Kitombo, somebody who then said, it is simply a creation, a political creation to create what we refer to as a dominant group, a group that is advantaged and has superior resources and rights in society, a perception of innate superiority or ability to oppress a minority group members, and ability to control political power. So it is a narrative that is actually intended to simply control the political power and to ensure the survival of a particular group as opposed to the other. And if you contrast that with an ethnic group, which is simply a collection of people who are distinguished by others or by themselves on the basis of their culture or their nationality characteristic, it may be language or religion. So if you look at that particular distinction, it's quite clear, because an ethnic group will ascribe itself not because of the color of their skin, but because of their language or their religion or their culture or their nationality, and then they will define themselves as people belonging to a particular ethnic group. And that is the only unique thing about them, that they speak a particular language, that they have a particular culture that they practice or they espouse that is different from the others. It does not make them any superior. It does not make them any inferior. It's only that they identify themselves based on those cultures, and they practice it because they believe that it is a good culture. That makes them a member of a particular ethnic group, which is different from the next ethnic group. You have what you refer to as a subordinate group, which the minority is a group whose members, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are disadvantaged and they are subjected to unequal treatment by the dominant group, which treatment then is not justifiable by virtue of their minority or by virtue of them being a subordinate group. And this is the question I've actually asked this particular morning as to whether affirmative action in promoting this particular minority group could then be a form of discrimination. And my answer to that question was yes, because for me, I come from the school of thought that affirmative action are policies, they are steps that are taken based on a particular historical fact of a particular injustice that have been practiced over time that limits this particular group from participating in equality with others. And therefore, it requires us to take certain positive steps to then bring them to speed so that they can be at par with the rest. And that being my understanding of that affirmative action simply means that then there must be a particular timeline when this particular affirmative action will then stop. So that if it doesn't stop, we will end up in a situation where now that particular practice that we refer to as affirmative action then becomes discriminatory, because then a particular group will then be given preferential treatment over the other. And I gave this particular example of the boy child, the affirmative action that was practiced on the girl child because of the historical injustices. And therefore, we were curing it by giving the girl child certain advantages so that she can then be able to come to the table and compete with the boy child. But we didn't put a timeline. So that today we still practice that affirmative action. As the University of Nairobi, we still admit girls at a lower cut-off point because then we wanted them at the university level, because a reality, we woke up one morning and the question then was, why don't we have a girl child at the professional level? Why don't we have a girl child at the university level? But then the argument was they can't be at the university level if they're not in high school. They will not be in high school if they're not in primary school. They will not be in primary school if they're not in nursery. They will not be in nursery if the idea we had in mind there that it is it's a waste to educate a girl because she will be married, she will go off. I'm not going to educate somebody's wife. I need to invest in my son, who will then come and invest in me. I'm investing for my old age. And it's based on that production that boys will not go. They will always be with their parent. The reality again, this social construct. The reality again today, as we speak, you'll find that girls take care of their parents better than the boys, but it might be as a result of that particular affirmative action. Because now it has reached a point where the boy child actually can't be employed. Without employee, he's been told he's a breadwinner, he's a leader of the house, and therefore, if you are not predisposed to assume that leadership, then you do not get yourself in that situation where somebody expects you to be a leader. So you live a solitary single life. So you work, you watch football, you drink, you do other things. You then don't get married because then you don't want to be this leader because you have no factors and means of production, because that opportunity has been given because all blue chip company, all renewable companies, all decided to become what? We are equal opportunity employer, where in reality, the equal opportunity employer will be to simply look at the staff that you have. And if you find that you have 60% or 70% male-dominated employment, then you stop employing the boy child until such a time that you try to attain 50-50, which was an okay policy. But then now we didn't stop at that. Now we have gone further, where now you will find that now we are at 70, 30, to the point where now a boy child applies, he doesn't get the job, to the point now where the girl child is now the one advocating and is coming out and saying, we forgot something along the way. We forgot this particular boy child. This boy child, we need to go back and bring the boy child, because the boy child now is scared. He's not doing what he's supposed to do. And these stories are all out there. We may find ourselves in that situation that Europeans are finding themselves, where a boy child, they stop marrying. And the effect of that is that a fundamental aspect of society then is lost, because society then dies. Because there are no younger people, the people are aging, there are no new people coming. That's why we have to bring Africans to this particular space, so that those elements we studied in first year about the states, the element that constitutes state, our population, the population is dying down. And once the population dies, then at some point in time, we may not then be able to defend that particular territory, the geographical territory that we define, that actually is an important element of a particular state. So that affirmative action, whatever it is, for me, my argument is it must have a time period where we will draw the line and say, we will do this for this number of period. After that, we will reevaluate this position to then determine whether we should go ahead with it or we'll have achieved the aim that we wanted to achieve. I don't think we have reevaluated the affirmative action that we did in ensuring the girl child is on the table. Because if we did that, we will then have noticed that the boy child was left behind at some point. When we talk about ethnic rhorism, is actually the coexistence of a variety of distinct racial and ethnic groups within one society. If you look at the French policy of assimilation, which is different from the policy the British were actually using of divide and rule, you create a superior dominant group which is superior to the other. They came up with this assimilation policy, which is a process by which members of a particular minority groups then become absorbed into the dominant culture, and the distinction then disappears, so that we are able to cure that particular distinction that has been used to justify that discrimination. But then the other day I saw instances where when a particular, in France, where a particular man risk his life, a black man risk his life to save a child from a pool, then a credit is being taken that indeed that is a French, what will I call it? The French spirit. But then when the same black man does a particular thing that we are born like defiles a particular minor or rape, then they are reminded that this black syndrome or this particular black bush mentality, suddenly the person stops becoming French embodiment of the French spirit, but then he becomes the crystallization of the Bushman attitude from Africa. So it is actually used conveniently to promote a particular end, and when it doesn't work, they then remind you of where you came from. We had that particular aspect of block assimilation through segregation, which is a spatial and the social separation of categories of people, either by race or by the ethnicity or by class or gender. So you put those silos and then you differentiate people based on that. And if you look at the civil rights movement in the US, it was not so much about a fight against racial discrimination. It was simply a fight against segregation, this compartmentalization of people based on their race, ethnicity, class, gender, and then using that particular silo to then accord them different treatment or different access to rights. So it was a fight for the bigger, there was a bigger picture about it, that all this particular compartmentalization actually is unwarranted, because today I may be put in this particular silo for being black, but the next one I'll be put in another one because of my religion or my gender or my class. And in all this particular compartmentalization, then I will be treated differently based on that. We also had elements of internal colonialism, which occurs when members of a particular racial or ethnic group are then conquered or colonized and forcibly placed under the economic and political control of a particular dominant group within a particular country. And if you want to look at that, if you look at America, which gives us a good example of that, when around 1830, when the legislation was passed, the Indian Removal Act, which then called for the relocation of all Native Americans who are the Red Indians to land west of the Mississippi. And in the Tales of Tears, the U.S. Army then rounded up all about 16,000 Cherokees and marched them to Oklahoma. In the process, some of their fundamental rights were violated because about 4,000 of them actually died. There were about 1,890. Delphine. Yes, so if you look at what happened to the Red Indians, where just by virtue of how they looked, decision was made that we need to move them to a particular place, displace them from the original land because they are different and therefore they warrant a different treatment. Closer home, if you look at the issue in Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, which genocide by itself is a deliberate systematic killing of an entire people or a nation, simply because of what? Their language and how their physical attributes. An idea was planted that the existence of this particular people interferes with your survival, and therefore, for you to be able to realize your full potential, we must then extinguish this particular group. And we believe that particular idea, and we go out of your way to then eliminate this particular people, believing that they are the reason why we cannot then achieve our full potential. The same thing with profiling people based on their ethnicity, where ethnicity in itself, and I've always argued that ethnicity is not a bad idea. It is not wrong to say I'm a Kamba, I identify as a Maasai, I identify as a Giriama, I identify as a Pokot. It is okay, and I think it should be encouraged because it gives us a sense of identity. But then it only becomes problematic when you then define yourself as a Pokomo, and then you also ascribe a certain superior definition to yourself by being a Pokomo, by saying, as a Pokomo, we are better than, and therefore we deserve more than the rest. And therefore you use that particular attribute to then discriminate or treat others negatively, simply because they do not then belong to the Pokomo community. That then becomes the negative aspect of ethnicity, when it is used to justify an unreasonable treatment or an unfair treatment of those who do not then belong to that particular class. And that is maybe why the vision Mwalimu Nyerere then had at that particular point in time, when he tried to kill that particular aspect of belonging to a particular ethnic group by encouraging the Tanzanians to really intermarry, so that at the end of the day, you do not then actually ascribe to a particular ethnic group, because already you are a mixture of different ethnicity, to the point where you end up just calling yourself, I am Mimi Tanzania. You can't define yourself as a Chaga or as whatever there is, because then in your family, it's a small united nation where you have all those particular people. Therefore, you cannot have that lens of treating people differently simply because of their language or their physical attribute. What are the driving forces behind this variety of discrimination on the basis of race? It's simply what we refer to as prejudice. And prejudice is simply a negative attitude based on a faulty generalization about the members of a selected racial and ethnic group. And at times, this particular generalization is actually ingrained in us at a very young age, to look at these particular people differently. And I'm sure prejudice and stereotype exist even in this class or in our society. And I'm sure you've heard those particular saying that these jobs of people who roast maize, cooks, watchmen is a privilege of people from the western part of the country. Is there a justification, a scientific justification that actually shows that those people are endowed with that particular quality, and that quality is not available anywhere? It's the same way we grow in a particular society where we are told, if, for instance, there's any bewitching or somebody, then you say, was a Kamba somewhere there, that person must be a Kamba. Or if somebody was told and say, Kikuyus by nature are thieves, is there scientific research that has been shown that actually shows that? But it's simply stereotyping, a particular faulty generalization that has been created about members of a particular racial or ethnic group, that now people then believe that, and therefore you always want to look at these particular people as such, that if this happened, it must be this one. If this happened, it must be this one. But there is no justification for that. And I was telling the class in the morning that I have some friends who are single and they are looking for husband, and they told me, we can't get married to Luos because Luos are potentially polygamous. I don't know whether that is true. Maybe Daktari can then explain that to us. That then it means that every Luo out there, the Luo nation that out there, they are all looking forward to marrying second wives. Yet in my space, I can hardly count how many of them then are polygamous. But then there are people who then are brought up with that particular notion. It has been generalized, and therefore it informs how they relate to that particular group. That yes, they may be the best individuals, you like them, but simply because of their language, you put them in a particular silo and say, no, if it comes to marriage, no, this is a route I do not want them to walk. The same way we will pick a particular community and say, people from the coast are lazy. But then you walk around this country, you'll find a lot of lazy people who are not from the coast. But then we generalize it, and then we decide this is how we are going to treat our people from a particular area through this prejudice and stereotyping. So therefore, when you look at that concept of race and therefore racism, it's simply a set of those attitudes, the beliefs, and the practices that is used to justify a particular superior treatment of one racial or ethnic group and the inferior treatment of another racial or a particular ethnic group, which leads us to that particular vicious circle of racism, which simply starts with that particular physical markers that are used to then distinguish groups and create social inequality based on race by means of either colonialism or based on slavery. And then you'll find that this different social condition among these subordinates, between these superordinates and subordinates, therefore creates this particular behavioral difference between them. For instance, the use of the term, these are energetic workers, these are lazy workers, which then leads to that perception of behavioral difference, which creates a racial stereotype that gets embedded in our culture. So that then you find that we grow up in the culture believing that this truism actually exists, but it's a truism, but they do not then, it is not a reality. It's a notion that has been perpetuated over a period of time, with the end result that it leads to discrimination, which therefore is that particular action or practices of this particular dominant group of members that have a harmful impact on members of a particular subordinate group. We are privy to a particular notion that was then created around the post-election violence, that there was a particular notion that had been created in this particular part of the country that only the Mau Maus fought for the independence, and therefore there was a particular oath that was taken at that point in time that the leadership of this particular country cannot leave or cannot cross a particular path, and therefore we must defend that with our lives, so that any attempt to try and take that country, we must then be ready to fight for it. When this is perpetuated over and over again, then you have people growing up believing that to be a truism and become a reality. And that's what leads to those kind of violence, because then we were told we must then defend this by all means possible. But if you look at the reality on the ground, the reality will be different. The way the world is actually moving, a time is coming where we might actually be all like the way we are in Tanzania, where you'll find that we will have a lot of interracial and inter-ethnic marriage that will then be able to kill that, and therefore we then ask ourselves that question: are we still going to block other people from certain positions? Yet now, those people actually, or us who then define ourselves different from the others, will not then be in existence. Or you'll notice that almost nowadays in the marriages that have been registered, you will find that 1 in 7 new marriages are between different racial or ethnic identity. So is it possible for us to have a colorblind society? If you look at Obama's election, it actually demonstrates, if you look at the history, Americans have actually walked over time with this issue of racial discrimination. You can easily say that, and I quote Kofi Annan, who then mentioned that Obama's election actually demonstrated America's extraordinary capacity to renew itself and adapt to a particular changing world by giving that opportunity, because they're coming from a history where the lines were drawn, either you're white or you're black. There was no this mixed thing, and actually if you try to mix, then the society will shun you away. But now it's reached a point where there is that particular acceptance, where now it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. We will look you based on your character, and you'll accept whatever position that you want. Of course, there is also a lot of discussion about the politics behind that particular election, that some have argued that it was assigned by the white superiorists to try and show that we have changed and now we are willing to accept the black. But then there are people who say that if that was true, why did you then go and accept a pure black person? You went and accepted a person who is neither black or white. But then, which again, that classification ends up even discriminating Obama even more, because then when you don't look at him as black or white, you leave him in this particular undefined territory where he is neither, yet he identifies himself as black. Are we really post that racial period? Obama, ideally, if you look at that election, isn't post-racial. He isn't the Messiah whose coming then ends bigotry and inequality for all time. Post-Obama, we have seen how blacks have actually been treated, and therefore the notion that now we have bridged that particular gap is actually not factual. We still have a few people who are actually stuck in the past, where they will treat you based their treatment. The treatment they will accord you will actually largely be based on how they perceive you. And therefore, you have that particular symbolic kind of ethnicity, which is that particular nostalgic allegiance to the culture of the immigrant generation, or that of the old country, or a love for and a pride in a particular tradition that can be felt without having to be incorporated in everyday behavior, which is not really a negative thing. It's simply a sense of identity that you want to identify with this. But as I've said, provided the same does not make you look at others in different, or look at others as deserving a lesser treatment than the one that you have. We have these particular white racial frames or racial ideas or stereotype images. And what are some of these? They are those which are based on ideology, the belief that we are superior, or bigotry or stereotype, the white fright that if you empower these people, they will come after us. Some of it is just emotional, which makes one feel better about oneself to identify as such, so you think you are any better than the rest. Or it may be criminal or materialistic, which is a race hatred due to economic fear, that if we empower these people, then we are going to see ground and our ability to control the economy is going to be affected. Or it can be politically territorial, which is a feeling an area belongs to a particular majority group to the exclusion of any other person. And this particular motive also leads us to what we refer to as the group norms, which at times seems acceptable, even desirable, more so if you look at the event of post 9/11, where there was a particular consensus that the Muslim community did not do enough to protect or prevent that from happening. And therefore, we then lumped everyone together, provided you're Muslim, then you're treated as a terrorist, which is unfair because the few that were involved had no sanction, and they were not doing it to promote the Muslim as a religion or Islam as a religion. But then that generalization then makes then people treat people differently. There's also that aspect of social distance, which is the extent to which people are willing to interact and actually establish a relationship with members of a racial and an ethnic group other than their own. You will find, depending on how you're brought up, this particular aspect of social distance may be instilled, so that then you may not really be looking at others differently. Is only that you've been made to believe that you need to keep a particular social distance, which then affects how then you relate to people who are not like you. On a one-on-one acts by members of the dominant group, you have those who individually perpetuate discrimination because of their identity, that they feel they are superior as compared to the others. But that is still something that they have in their mind. More importantly, on race and discrimination, there's what we refer to as institutional discrimination, which simply are those day-to-day practices of an organization and an institution that have a harmful impact on members of a minority group. While this is no longer legal, we have some informal practices that linger and continue to benefit the majority group. We have seen situations where we may not speak loudly about it, but then you see where we want to employ, and this actually reminded me of the speech the president was actually making on Sunday, where he said in his administration, he promised and he committed the people of Kenya that his administration will ensure that no particular ethnic group will simply have an unfair advantage because they belong to a particular community. Appointments will be based on merit. And trust my fellow Kenyans. My fellow Kenyans went on X and they were able to extract a list of 49 public appointments, which spoke to a particular appointments that were made under this regime. And the question then they were asking the president, which country were you talking about in particular? Can you then be clear on the same? So there are those particular institutional discrimination that they may not be very loud, but then they are being done in some very soft way. And those are even the more dangerous because they are done right on your face, but then they will be coached in terms of, but this person has merit. He has the right papers, he qualifies. But then the question then will be in a public service where we all contribute to pay taxes without that particular preference, that when it comes to paying taxes, there is no distinction, there is no discrimination. But then when it comes to the public appointments, then you can see a particular kind of distinction. And then it is qualified by saying, but everyone is merited, they have papers, ask them whether they have papers. But even the ones you're leaving out, they have papers, and that is why Dr. Stevie, sitting in Bomas, came up with that particular notion that, well, That may be true. We need to appoint people based on merit, but also we must ensure that those public appointments actually reflect the face of Kenya. You have to go reach out. And if they're not there, you must then empower them so that then they can serve in these particular positions which are in public service. A brief facts in conclusion, which I borrowed from the American fights for emancipation. Today, as we speak, Blacks have been have 375 years history on the American continent. 245 involving 245 of those 375 years they were in slavery. 100 years they were involved in discrimination, and only 30 years where they have been involved in anything else other than slavery and discrimination. And this was a quote by a historian, Roger Wilkins, who made that particular finding. It is also stated about the American community that by 2056, that the root of an average American resident will be from anywhere in the world. It will be from everywhere in the world except Western Europe. And today, 5 workers for every 1 Social Security recipient you will find will be a Black person. And 3 for every 1 will be a non-white. So that particular, what they were propagating as pure white, with time, that is actually disappearing very fast. And we hope that with that, then we will not then be able to distinguish people and treat them different simply because of their color of their skin. That color of their skin is in our eyes. It doesn't speak to their blood. It doesn't speak to their attribute. Their attribute, their blood, the O positive in Nairobi is the O positive you'll find in New York. The person who's O positive in New York, be he white, colored, or black, it will be the same O positive. It will not be a different kind of blood simply because of the color of your skin. I will open up for discussion. Yeah, there's a lot of materials that and comments for us to learn in the chat section. So please take note of that. Yes, Daktari. Daktari, you were saying something. You're muted.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, Jared.
Today's section has been a bit technical. Are there maybe some handouts that we can read just to internalize what you have learned today?
I will share even the PowerPoint presentation that I was supposed to make, but then Dr. Moser had not made me co-host to share. So I will. Do you have a Google Classroom for this class? No.
Not yet.
Okay, class rep, you can reach out to me, then I can then share through email.
If I may add, please share the previous slides as well.
I will. So class rep, just share with me your email, and then I'll forward the same. Then you can share with the class.
Excuse me, Mwalimu.
Yes, Washington.
Is it okay if our class reps will be given an okay to form that Google Classroom so that whatever you're sending can be in order and maybe can be easier for you and someone else who joins to follow instead of resending whenever someone's out there and
that is
keep
fine.
on asking the same thing?
That class rep, please. I think that's a good suggestion. please do so. And I think add all of us so that then whatever materials we have, we can then post them there so that they can be accessed by everyone. Thank you, Washington. Good.
Hello, excuse me, Malim.
Yes, Chrysostom.
Yes, you had suggested that you think some affirmative action should have been accompanied by a time duration when it should elapse.
I strongly believe in that there should be a time frame when we can reevaluate.
Yes, makes sense. I just wanted to get reaction if there is if my female colleagues agree or would subscribe to that.
That I think they should. I think it makes a lot of sense, because now our female colleagues now are the ones on the forefront crying about the boy child and the need to empower the boy child, because they also appreciate that now we have a new societal problem. And largely it may have been because one of the causes among many may be that a particular affirmative action, because then we all want to have sons. I am a father of actually 4 daughters, but then I subscribe to that particular notion that at some point in time, I also want my daughters to get married to reasonable and responsible men. But then if the system is in such a way that we are not able to produce them, then who will they get married to? I don't want them to go to the West to look for the husbands. I want them to be locally here and to be in our village with Dr. Okoth.
Mwalimu, you're speaking to young men who are not married.
I know. We should ask them why they're not married. What is the challenge? And they will tell you, they will tell you these particular challenges that are out here. And there are many. There are many challenges. We count ourselves lucky, those who are married those days. The challenges that is out there it's surmountable, but then it requires a lot of affirmative action. Good then. Allow me then to stop there for today.
May I?
Yes, Daktari, I called you. I don't know where you disappeared to.
Oh, sorry, sir. I was contemplating. You gave a very heavy dose today, so I almost dozed off because of the not delivery style, but the magnitude. But Mwalimu, I really agree with your analysis, and it opened my eyes on a couple of areas. But when it comes to our courts, our courts seem to be shy. I wanted to bring your attention, I'm sure you are aware of this, the so-called Cambridge 6, the Cambridge 6 case, which is a case of, there is this research project that goes on in Kilifi, and
Yes.
Wellcome Trust and Cambridge has a big research project there. And so it purports that it's pairing upcoming scholars, and it's supposed to also offer PhD grants. But over time, it was so clear that it paved way for European young scholars at the detriment of young scholars from Kenya. The matter found its way to our courts, more specifically the industrial court as it was at the time.
Yes.
And if you look at the kind of jurisprudence that emerges, is that you feel that this shyness, and it's not just in this matter. I have seen 2 others within our country. You see the shyness of our judges to analyze this race issue. Yet Justice Nduma, who was a PJ for the Employment and Labor Relations Court for some time, is a very progressive judge, very exposed. But you see the shyness to deal with a racial question as not only a personal dignity question, but a collective human dignity question, which is different from this personalized dignity question. So this is different, sir, from what you see in South Africa, for example, where, as you rightly cited, race has been a bigger issue. It's different from what you see in the United States. So is it possible, yet in my experience, I have personally in my professional life been exposed to racist discrimination by in a project. I worked on a project with a colleague from Oxford, and unfortunately, very unfortunately, she was also a woman, which presents a double problem for me as a conscientious person, because I was conscientious not to be seen, not to be deferring to the authority of herself as a woman, but yet it is not lost to me that she was a white woman, older than me, and also of professional longevity. But she would use words in her emails like, "This is commonsensical. I thought this is straightforward. This you should have known." And in my view, I found those to be racist and undertones. And when I raised the concern before the board of Oxford, they analyzed it as a labor performance issue rather than a racial relation issue. And I fear that our courts here, instead of taking a strong position when it comes to such relations, like you see in this Cambridge case, they are a bit shy. Why do you think we have such weak jurisprudence on this matter?
My simple answer to that, or my thoughts, would be it's not really black and white, because there was a discussion one time as to whether the politics of the day informs the decisions that come from the courts. And I will not put it past the government of the day. And this, for those of us who claim to be Cosmos scholars, at times when we make this admission, it looks like a very worrying trend, where we see, or we want to make an admission that there is an executive interference in the manner in which certain decisions are then rendered by the courts. And I will not put it past them, in the sense that if you look at the case you cited, and if you look at the case that of Kenyatta University, with that particular land that was being given to, I think, World Health Organization to establish a particular facility there, which was simply being done through an executive fiat, that you will have to, it's a public institution, will have to do it like that. So it doesn't matter what a particular court then will say. If the executive has taken this direction, it has. The same way, if you look at the aid that we keep on getting, and the president will then be invited, promised, it will not be in our general knowledge, but then you will then see the policies we've had over time. Then suddenly you can see from the government a relaxation of a particular stand, which then will transcend to the judiciary. And then you'll see the judiciary then taking a position that actually is akin to one that helps the government. And you remember one time the president was asking the judiciary that they must be partners in development. They cannot be the people who stop the development. That speaks a lot of volume, in the sense that the executive is simply saying that when you see us doing something, it's something that we've thought about, we have planned about it. You only need to aid because you're also part of government. So you must then assist us in doing this. So that if you look at even the issue raising in Cambridge, fine, it was an entry point. And if you look at Cambridge, Cambridge is actually supported and funded heavily by the American wing. It's called what? There's an American military wing that does research, and you'll find them in the
Walter Reed.
Walter Reed, thank you, Odhiambo. You will find Walter Reed is actually behind a lot of those societies with a lot of funding. So when they put in the money, they also have, they keep on dictating what needs to be done. And Dr. Odhiambo, you've been in the civil society and the NGO for the longest time. You know how money comes from the West and how money goes back. So they insist that a sufficient amount of money then will have to go back. That is why you see recently Kagame has taken a different position. We don't mind, you bring all your NGOs here to Rwanda, but 80% of the money that comes in must remain here, must be utilized here. That might actually affect the number of NGOs that actually will be in Rwanda. So if you see something like that, then there is other powerful hand that will also inform the kind of decision that the courts will then make. If you saw a lot of the noise that was around the judiciary with regard to the housing levy, and somehow the way now the judiciary will use all manner of lingua and other jurisprudence to then justify that now the levy is constitutional. It has abide by the law, is because of the influence of the executive. The executive at the end of the day gets its way. Of course, we keep on demanding for the independence of the judiciary, but it's a very noble concept. Whether it actually apply in every situation, then that is doubtful. There's a gray area there. I personally believe there are times judges sit and like in the case, the CGHQ case versus the Minister for Home Affairs in the UK, where the courts just came out blatantly and said, well, you are right to form trade union as a security people working in the security sector. We will not allow you to form that, because as a code, we will not be able to guarantee the security of the state. That is a mandate that is better placed within the executive. And being a policy issue, the courts will not engage on that particular issue on matters of policy. Policy are better handled in the executive. So what we were arguing is that what if the policy itself is contrary to the constitution? Do we then leave it to the ambit of the executive then to violate the constitution and leaving us with no avenue to complain against that particular policy? Because that's what the court was simply saying. On matters policy, courts will sit on their hands. They will exercise judicial restraint and not pronounce themselves on those particular issues, and defer to the executive to exercise its better judgment, even if that particular judgment is one that violates the constitution. So I see the hand of the executive in some of the jurisprudence that come from our jurisdiction. Some of it even, you cited one, but even there are other cases where you don't see a consistent what Professor Mbote would call the golden thread in our jurisprudence, where you can see we are incrementally developing a particular jurisprudence. So we have today this court says this, tomorrow this court says this, and a good example, look at what is matrimonial property. Do we have a position on how to handle a matrimonial property based on the decisions that have come from the court? What is matrimonial? How do we divide them? More so when the woman is not working. Do you have a clear position of how to divide these two from the jurisprudence that you're having? We will go there. We will all cite a particular decision from the Court of Appeal that aid a particular argument that I want to advance. The Supreme Court didn't also give us clear direction on a settled position on that. Yet I thought the court should give clear direction, clear position, so that the law is settled. Everyone who then goes every day says the law must be predictable. We more or less need to know the outcome based on the facts that we've been given. If you're given this fact, you should then be able, with some level of certainty, predict a particular outcome. That's not the case.
Thank you. I totally agree with you.
Thank you. Colleagues, allow me to stop there for now. It has been a long day of talking throughout. So have a good evening.
Thank you, Saito.
Thank you and good evening too.
Huyo ni Otula.
Thank you.